How many of you, you have things that you bought a long time ago and they're still like new? Anyone? You have maybe some tools that you bought a long time ago and they're just great tools. There are things that maybe we would call buy it for life things. It amazes me how well certain things can last. Back in 1977, there was a spacecraft called Voyager 1 that was launched. And Voyager 1, the whole point of Voyager 1 was to go study the outer planets in our solar system and then to keep going, to take pictures and to send them back to Earth so that we could get different perspectives on the solar system that we live in. And so this spacecraft was launched in 1977. So about 45 years ago now. About 5 years ago, so 40 years after its initial launch, certain things were happening with the trajectory, and scientists said, you know what, we need to alter the trajectory of Voyager 1, which meant sending a signal to a 40-year-old spacecraft on the other side of our solar system to make it alter course. Now, when they began having this conversation, they had no idea if this was going to work or not, because 40 years flying through space with this much maintenance, okay, we ain't sending crews to go keep it up, right? 40 years of all of this radiation in space, just traveling at these astronomical speeds. They had no idea if this would even succeed. But they said, we have to send this signal, and if it works, great, and if it doesn't work, then there's nothing else we can do. And so they send the signal telling one of these thrusters to go off this exact amount to get it back onto course. And minutes later, as Voyager received this signal, the thrusters fired perfectly. Incredible feat of engineering, right? I know we have a number of engineers in this room, and can you just fathom how much work went into making this spacecraft that had been flying through space for 40 years actually function hundreds of thousands, if not millions of miles away? Incredible. Today, you and I, we might have specific things in our lives that are built to last, that are buy it for life products. I remember when I was young hearing about Craftsman tools. We have any Craftsman guys in here? Anybody, any Craftsman guys in here? Got a couple of them, Craftsman. You can go for a while, right? You could go to Sears and you could get them replaced because you bought it for life. When you bought Craftsman, you bought it for life. Good luck going to Sears now and returning those. But the tools outlasted the store you bought them in. So hey, that's a good product, right? And we all have these things. We don't like to spend our money on things that we know are going to break in 6 months, do we? We don't like to buy that tool that we know is going to be cheap and it's going to. If we do it, why? Because the price is right and we can't afford the nicer thing. But given the option, we all want to buy things that last, don't we? We love being able to look at that thing that we purchased 15, 20, 30, some of you probably 50 years ago, you bought this item and it still works like it did when you bought it. What a wonderful thing. What a great thing to be able to say about those manufacturers. We want things that last. Can I tell you this morning that it should be no different when it comes to our walk with Jesus? Our walk with Jesus ought to be designed to last. Jesus, in a couple of the Gospels, he tells a story of a sower who goes out into a field to sow. And as he sows, as he throws out this seed, it falls on certain types of soil. It falls on specifically 4 types of soil. Of those 4, 3 types of soil the seed begins to grow on, right? 3 types of soil the seed begins to grow on, but only one of them does Jesus call the good soil. And what's the difference between the 2 that it grows on and the one that's called good? Well, one lasts. One grows up. One bears fruit. And 2 of them begin to show some signs of life and then die for different reasons. And so here, as we come into Hebrews chapter number 10, we're looking at a transitional chapter within the book of Hebrews. This whole book is written to Jewish believers that are now scattered all over the known world, that are facing persecution because of their faith in Jesus Christ. And this author, this mysterious author of Hebrews, is saying, God has not forgotten you. God is still speaking to you. God knows what you are enduring. And he takes 9.5 chapters, So midway through where we're going to go today, just to tell about how good God is and how Jesus is better than anything else you can compare him to. And then in the middle of the chapter that we're studying today, he turns a corner. And he says, because Jesus is all of these things and all of these things are true, we then have to respond in some specific ways. And so today, as we dig into this, we're going to be reminded of all of the things that he spoke or he wrote in the first 9 chapters. And then we're going to see how it begins to apply to you and I, even today, 2,000 years later, reading this wonderful, this ancient, this preserved text of Scripture. And so let's begin by looking at Hebrews chapter number 10. Let's start where all good things start, verse number 1, right at the beginning. Watch what he writes. For since the law has but a shadow of the good things to come, instead of the true form of these realities, it can never, by the same sacrifices that are continually offered every year, make perfect those who draw near. Otherwise, would they not have ceased to be offered? Since the worshipers, having once been cleansed, would no longer have any consciousness of sins. But in these sacrifices, there is a reminder of sins every year, for it's impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins. And so these first 4 verses, he tells us, he brings us back and he kind of anchors us in the things that were known. Now, let me just say this for all of us. We all have a natural pull toward the known. You have a natural pull toward the known. The things that you are familiar with. The things that are comfortable to you. You and I, we all have our routines, right? The things that we like to do as soon as we get up in the morning. This is what we like to do before we get up. This is what we like to do before we go to bed. The things that are in our control, we have our rhythms and our systems that we like things to be. And we all have this natural pull towards the things that we know. That's why many of you, if you're going to eat out today, you're probably going to eat at a restaurant that you've been to before, right? Most of us in here, you're not going to say, oh, let's go try that new thing that I've never had before. That happens every once in a while. And then what happens next? You go to the place that you went before, or the new place that now you've gone back to. We like to do the things that we've done before. Occasionally, we like to get outside of our comfort zone, but only when we're in control of when we go outside of our comfort zone. And so what we find is that there's a natural pull. These Jewish believers were being pulled back towards these sacrificial systems. But the author of Hebrews, he's reminding them, he's saying, listen, guys, if those sacrifices were good enough to get you where you ought to be, wouldn't you have just have offered that sacrifice once and been done? But how often did they have to go offer those sacrifices? Year after year after year after year after year. They were going and they were offering sacrifices. Why? Because they were not enough. They were not enough. As I was thinking about some of these things in the shadow and substance, that imagery that the author of Hebrews used, I was reminded of a time as a teenager. My dad pastored a small church in rural Indiana. City of 5,000 was the largest city in the county of 10,000 people. We were out in this small town, lovely people. And my dad pastored this church. This church had what was called at the time a prophet's chamber. Anyone know what a prophet's chamber is in here? Awesome. Like no one. Okay, great. I love this. So what this was a space that people who were traveling through could stay in the church. It was like, think of like an apartment that was like attached to the church. People could go, they could stay the night there instead of having to rent a hotel room, this or that. And so anytime guests would come through, missionaries, this or that, they would call up the church and they would just stay in the space. For some reason, and I have no idea how this got there, in this space, and I was a teenager, pastor's kid, I like to explore all the different parts of the church and this and that, right? For some reason, there was a cardboard cutout of Jesus. Why? I don't know, but I'm not kidding you. 6 foot tall, cardboard cutout of Jesus. I Googled it this week and I should have put a picture up that we can throw up on the slides. I can show you after the service if you want to see it. 6 foot tall, cardboard cutout of Jesus. It was the funniest, just most random, okay, why does that exist? To be honest, I don't know. But being a mischievous teenager, I had some friends that their family were also in ministry. And so they came by and they stayed there one night. And so I came by the church and my dad, I went to go hang out with my friends. My friends weren't out of bed yet. And so I said, hey, can I go get them up? Their parents were down there like, yeah, go get them. So when I went up there, I had this brilliant idea. I grabbed the cardboard cutout of Jesus. They were sleeping in a room that had no outside windows, so it was dark. I put the cardboard cutout of Jesus at the foot of their bed, found a reading light that I could clip onto the back of Jesus, plugged it in, turned it on, and started making a bunch of noise. They wake up and see this backlit Jesus standing at the foot of their bed and just like start losing it. What in the world is happening right now? There's a strange place, there's a bunch of noise, and there's a shadowy figure standing at the foot of their bed. Okay? I don't know why I'm telling you all of that. But here's the thing. Could you imagine if you came to church one Sunday and the pastor was like, guys, I want to introduce you to Jesus, and he drug out a cardboard cutout and he was like, this is Jesus. How weird would that be? Can we all agree that would be weird? I happen to have here today, I'm totally kidding. I got nothing. Here's the thing. We would all be like, that's not Jesus. I mean, maybe it's meant to like represent a picture of Jesus, whatever, but it's not Jesus. Could you imagine, for those of you who have kids, if you went home today and you were like, you're talking to your spouse and you said, hey, you know what? Life would be a lot easier if we replaced our kids with cardboard cutouts. As someone with kids, that's a true statement. So you guys just came up with this idea. You're like, you know what? We'll have our kids are going to go live with someone else. They're going to go become Bowmans now. And so you're stuck with them. And we'll have the cardboard cutouts. We'll keep these around us. And we'll get all of our love and affection from these cardboard cutouts of our children. How does that work? No, it's a shadow of this thing that's actually real. It's a representation of something better. But here's the point that the author of Hebrews is trying to make. He's saying, hey, friends, you're wanting to go back to the sacrificial system and leave behind Jesus, who is the true and better sacrifice. And you know what that's like? That's like trading your kids for cardboard cutouts. Because one of those is sufficient and real, and the other is a representation of the thing that was going to come that was better than what could ever be. And so he begins to speak of this need for the real thing. The temporary doesn't replace it. But even still, what we find, even you and I, it becomes easy to fall into ruts within our worship. It becomes easy for us to elevate the things of worship over the object of our worship. We all have this pull toward the known. You have it, I have it. It's useless denying it. It exists, but it has to be resisted. Watch as he continues in this chapter. Look at verse number 5. Consequently, when Christ came into the world, he said, sacrifices and offerings you have not desired, but a body you have prepared for me. And burnt offerings and sin offerings you've taken no pleasure. Then I said, behold, I have come to do your will, O God. It's written of me in the scroll of the book. Keep reading here. Verse number 8. When he said above, you have neither desired nor taken pleasure in sacrifices and offerings and burnt offerings and sin offerings. These are offered according to the law. Then he added, behold, I have come to do your will. He does away with the first in order to establish the second. And by that will, we have been sanctified through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ once for all. Okay, so a lot's happening here in this passage. It's really, really, really fascinating. I want you to get a grasp on what is taking place, okay? What we see here is we see that the author here is quoting, he attributes it to Christ, but he's drawing from the Old Testament here. Specifically, starting in verse 5, he's pulling from Psalm 40. Okay? And so he's going back to Psalm 40, and in verse number 10, he starts quoting from the book of Matthew. But as he's quoting here, he's saying this: sacrifices and offerings you have not desired, a body you have prepared for me. So this is the Messiah speaking before his birth by hundreds of years in the Psalms. And so he begins to kind of play this out and says, here's what's going on. A body you have prepared for me because it's better than the sacrifices that are being offered. But then he says this in verse number 8 and 9. Verse number 9, he says, he added, I have come to do your will. So what's happening in 5 and 6, we see, you didn't want this, you didn't want this, these sacrifices were not the fulfillment of your desire, but I have come. We have what we call a contrast here between the old and the new. And so God says, listen, the old is being done away with, and the new is coming in. But here's the thing. The new was the thing all along. The new was the thing all along. The old was the shadow of, the silhouette of, but the new was the thing where they were going. And so the old didn't exist just for the old. It existed to point to the new, which is when Jesus came in and said, listen, I've come to do your will. I came to do the things that God wanted me to do here. But what does that mean for us? You see, this is pulling those Jewish believers. For all of these chapters, they're hearing these things that they were familiar with, and Jesus is superior to them. Jesus is better than, he's greater than, has more power than. And they're hearing it, and they're hearing it, and they're hearing it. But what's happening now? Understand this. Here is the point that this author is trying to make. The call of God is better than your comfort zone. The call of God is better than your comfort zone. Did you know God is going to call you to the uncomfortable? Follow God, and it's not promised just a life of ease. There will be difficult days in your life. But can I say this just as clearly as possible? The call of God's better than your comfort zone. You see, you have a choice to go into retreat and to only do the things that are easy and that are capable, that you can understand and that you can fathom and wrap your mind around. If you want to go do that, great, fine, do it. You're missing out because the call of God is better. Does that mean the call of God is easier? No, far from it. Far from it. And even next week, what we're going to see as we get into chapter number 11, we're going to go into what many have called the Hall of Faith. So play on the Hall of Fame, right? This Hall of Faith, these men and women who followed God and were well known for this calling of God. But I want to tell you here today that Hebrews chapter 11 that we're going to look at next week, it's not about those men and women, it's about the God that they served. And I'll prove it to you next week. Hebrews chapter number 11. But what we see in common with each of those individuals, they stepped out of the place that they were comfortable. They stepped out of where they could have remained. Moses was a son of Pharaoh's daughter. He was royalty in Egypt. And yet what did he do? He left. Abraham was in a city that he had wealth and he had riches. And God called him to a place he'd never seen before. What did he do? He left. Over and over and over again, we see these promises, we see these things given, and we see people that leave their comfort zone to follow God. And then what does God do? How often does God disappoint? 20% of the time? 10% of the time? 0% of the time. God's call is better than your comfort zone every single time. Watch what's happening in verse number 11. Every priest stands daily at his service, offering repeatedly the same sacrifices which can never take away sins. But when Christ had offered for all time a single sacrifice for sins, he sat down at the right hand of God, waiting from that time until his enemies should be made a footstool for his feet. For by a single offering, he's perfected for all time those who are being sanctified. And the Holy Spirit also bears witness to us, for after saying, this is the covenant that I will make with them. After those days, declares the Lord, I will put my laws on their hearts, write them on their minds. Then he adds, I will remember their sins and their lawless deeds no more. Where there is forgiveness of these, there is no longer any offering for sin. So what he's describing to us in these passages, and in this specific set of these verses, the sacrificial system over and over and over again, having to come back and having to come back and having to come back, the people were bound to the sacrificial system. I mean, if every year you have to go, at least minimum, every year you have to go and offer a sacrifice at the temple, and you're kind of stuck, aren't you? That's what you have to do according to these laws and these regulations. You're going back and you're going back and you're going back. But all of a sudden, through Jesus, what kind of sacrifice is being given? Verse number 14, for by a single offering, he has perfected for all time those who are being sanctified. And then the Holy Spirit bears witness. This is the covenant I'll make with them. Verse 16, after those days, declares the Lord, I'll put my laws on their hearts, write them in their minds. And then verse 17, I will remember their sins and their lawless deeds no more. So how does the death of Jesus, the sacrifice of Jesus, change us? How does the sacrifice of Jesus impact our day-to-day lives? Watch this. The sacrifice of Jesus sets us free. It sets us free. What does it set us free to do? To follow him. The sacrifice of Jesus sets us free to follow him. What you're going to find, and what we're going to find together in the next set of verses, is not all of a sudden, because he has set us free from sin and he's forgiven our sin, go behave lawlessly. You won't find that. You don't see that. Instead, he enters into this discourse that now begins to apply these truths very directly, very specifically to the life of the believer. So how does Jesus' death set us free? Let's keep reading verse number 19. Therefore, so this is the corner of the whole book right here. Therefore, because of 9.5 chapters worth of content, here is what we are saying. Therefore, brothers, since we have confidence to enter the holy places by the blood of Jesus, by the new and living way that he opened for us through the curtain that is through his flesh, since we have a great priest over the house of God, let us draw near with a true heart, in full assurance of faith, with our hearts sprinkled clean from an evil conscience and our bodies washed with pure water. So look at the beginning of that phrase in verse number 22. He says, therefore, thou shalt do this. Is that what's being said here? What's that phrase? Therefore, let us. What is that implying? What's that indicating? That's permission. That's permission to do these things. Why is it not given as this thou shalt? Because you ought to want to do the thing that he's giving you permission to do. If you're a sports fan and I said, hey, afterwards, your favorite sports player is going to be here in the lobby. You can go out there, you can meet him, you can get his autograph, you can high five him. If you're a sports fan, you're going to be excited about that offer, aren't you? I'm not going to have to tell you twice. You're going to hear that. If I have to tell you twice, it's going to be because you don't believe what's actually happening. If I said, hey, I got you some tickets to your favorite team playing in the biggest game of the year, you'd say, what can I do to make this happen? Not, oh, do I have to go? I mean, could you imagine that? Oh, listen, you get a chance to go do this thing that you've always wanted to do. You like musicals, your favorite musical, they're on Broadway. I bought you tickets to get there. I bought you tickets to the show. I paid for the hotel room. You can go and you can have the time of your life. Take your best friend, take your spouse, go just have a blast. Oh, do I have to? No, that's not the response you'd give. You'd say, when does it start? When can I leave? And so now what we see that Jesus here has opened us up into a place that we did not have access before. You remember a couple of weeks ago, if you were here with us, we looked at the tabernacle, this place where those priests would go and they would do their priestly duties. But then even past what the average priest was able to go into was the Holy of Holies, the most holy place, representative of the throne room of God. And only that high priest could go in. And even then, he could only go in one time a year, not just at will. And so this was a place that was sacred and reserved. What's Hebrews telling us here? You can go into that place, not the picture of one, not the one that's a shadow, but you can go into the real thing anytime you want. You can go before God on your own as a result of the sacrifice that Jesus Christ gave for you. No longer is there need for sacrifices of animals, of bulls and goats. No longer is there a need for a priest to intercede on your behalf. Why? Because Jesus is the better sacrifice. Jesus is the better priest. And when Jesus hung on the cross, his body being destroyed was a symbol of that veil of the temple being torn open and being shredded, that now you can go in before God covered in the blood of Jesus Christ, and you need no one else. You have access to God, and you can draw near to him. So then, why are some of us not close to God? Why are we far from God then? Why do we still have sin and wickedness, and why do we still battle these things? Why, as individuals, are there people that are part of a church or claim to be a Christian or claim to be religious that are so far away from God? Listen, as a believer in Jesus Christ, I want you to hear this as loud and clear as I can be. You are as close to God as you want to be. You're as close to God as you want to be. We make time for the things that are important to us, don't we? I mean, listen. Football season's coming up. Some of you guys are going to be glued to that TV every single Saturday. By some of you guys, I mean some of us guys, right? Let's just call it how it is. We make time for the things that are important to us. So if you're not following God, if you're not drawing near into his presence, you say, I believe in Jesus Christ. I've put my faith in him. I'm a child of God, a brother, a sister of Jesus Christ. I have been forgiven, but yet I'm so far away from God. Whose decision is that at this point? What does James write to us just in the next book over here? He says what? Draw nigh to God. He's going to draw nigh to you. He's going to draw near to you. You come close to God. What's God going to do? Oh no, they're coming again. No, he wants to walk with you. He wants to be known by you. He already knows you. You're as close to God as you want to be. And so we're invited, we are freed to draw near. But not only that, watch in verse number 23. Let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering, for he who promised is faithful. And let us, I'm going to get ahead of myself. Verse 23, let's hold on there for a minute. Let's hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering. So what's the second thing we're free to do? We're free to hold fast. We're free to hold fast. Now this term here, hold fast, the way that I understand it is this is a nautical term. The boats of the day that used sails, what did you have to do with those sails? You had to align the sails so that the wind would catch into the sail, be able to propel the boat the direction that you wanted it to go. So relied heavily on this system. Well, how are those all attached? Well, if you've ever seen a movie that's done anything nautical with like a boat that has sails, there are ropes attached to these, and you have to do what? Grab onto these ropes. Well, there are times that it's difficult to hold on to those ropes, right? The wind's blowing, gusting, there's a storm that's coming up, the waves are tossing around, there's momentum that wants to swing those sails ways that they are not supposed to go. But what happens if the sailors let go of that rope? What happens to the sail? Whatever the wind wants it to do, right? Whatever the sea wants it to do. It can cause damage, it can cause injury, it can cause all sorts of things. And so these sailors, they would have to remind themselves to hold fast to the moorings of these boats. Now, how many of you have ever participated in a tug of war? All right, a lot of us, right? Track and field day at school or whatever. We go out and you grab that rope. How do your hands feel when you're done with a tug of war? Great, right? You exfoliate, get all that skin up. No, you look at your hands and you're like, why did I do that? Why did I just skin my hands to lose the tug of war on track and field day? And some of you guys are probably that kid that once it started to hurt a little bit, you let go of the rope. You got any of those in here? All right, and some of you are probably the ones that the team is dragging you, but you're not gonna let go. You're gonna hold on, and it doesn't matter. They might be going 50 yards with you, but you're gonna hold on to that rope. as we have the opportunity, we're not holding on to a rope. What are we holding on to? We're holding on to the things that we are taught, the things that we have heard, this gospel of Jesus Christ, the confession of our hope. And how are we holding fast to it? He says, without wavering. You know what happens in that tug of war? You start feeling that pull and you say, is it really worth it? And you guys at least there where you considered, is it really worth it to be holding on to this rope? My hands hurt, they're burning a little bit. Why am I holding on to this? Now imagine a sailor at the sea. I'm sure this has happened hundreds, if not thousands of times, where the storm blows and it gets difficult to hold on. And so they say, is this really worth it for me to hold on? I don't know how much longer I can go. But yet, a good sailor holds on anyways, until they're no longer able to hold on. They keep that grip as long as they are able to keep that grip. They endure even through that difficulty. They hold fast. The picture that is being painted for us here is not a life of ease and we just continue to do the thing that we've always done because it's easy to do. Holding fast is difficult because there is something that is being pulled away. There is something that is being wrestled away. And so holding fast requires a determination to continue to hold fast. Now, I want you to understand this. Endurance isn't easy, but it is worth it. Endurance isn't easy, but it is worth it. How many of those sailors, they got to the other side of that storm and their hands are blistered and bloody, but they held on to that rope. Do you think they're sitting there going, man, I really regret holding on to that rope? It would have been really great if I just let that go on and then the ship capsized or went the wrong direction or a sail goes and hurts one of my crewmates or no, what are they saying? Hey, I hope we don't hit a storm like that again. But are they regretting the way that they held on? No. As believers in Jesus Christ, there are going to be times it's very difficult for you and I to hold on and to endure the season. There are going to be times that we're sitting there going, wouldn't it just be easier to let go? Wouldn't it just be easier to walk away? Wouldn't it just be easier to? But can I encourage you this morning? Endurance, it's not easy, but it is worth it. It's worth it. Because on the other side of that storm, you'll be glad that you hung on. You'll be glad that you gave it your all and that you held fast to what was taking place. But I want you to continue to follow me here in verse number 25. Let's start with verse number 24. Let us consider how to stir up one another. So the final let us statement, let us consider how to stir up one another to love and good works, not neglecting to meet together as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another. And all the more as you see the day drawing near. And so what we see finally, the last let us statement that he makes, is that let us consider one another. Let us think about each other. You know what it doesn't say? Think about ourselves. As you're holding fast, who are we thinking of? It's not just your life that's affected, it's the lives of those around you. And then even as we consider one another, what are we considering one another for? We're considering one another, watch this, to provoke to love and to good works, or to encourage to love and good works. That word literally means to provoke, to stir up is how the English Standard Version reads. But it's literally talking about going in and stirring, to provoke, to move towards some sort of action. But what are we provoking towards? What are we stirring up towards? Those we often think of being like anger, right? Oh man, she just got all riled up. Oh man, they just really provoked her. That's not what we're provoking towards. What are we provoking towards? Love and good works. What does that look like? What does that look like? Can I tell you what that looks like? Hey Bob, so-and-so's having a hard time. Can you come with me? Let's go see them. Let's go see what they need. Let's go take them dinner. What is that doing? That's provoking to love and good works. Hey, I haven't seen so-and-so for a while. I heard they have this going on in their life. Hey, let's give them a call. Man, so-and-so, they just got a bad diagnosis. Let's pray for them. And here's what it is. It's not just doing it myself. Although, can I tell you, it's easier to do things yourself a lot of times, right? Can we all attest to that? Sometimes it's just easier to do it yourself. Is that what we're told to do here? What are we told to do? To provoke to love and good works. To take others and help them to demonstrate the love of God to others as well. You see, it's not an isolation passage. It's not a, therefore let you. Did you notice that? Not only is it permission, it's also plural. Let us do these things. And then he continues in this passage and he says, not forsaking the gathering, the assembling together. So not devaluing the act of just the body of Jesus Christ getting together. There's value in the thing that we are doing today. Why do we do the thing that we are doing today? To provoke to love and to good works. We come together. We don't forsake or cast off or devalue the gathering together as some do. But what do? We do it even more because, hey, there's a day coming when all of these hopes will be made into realities. Let's continue. Let's finish up here in chapter number 10. Verse 26, for if we go on sinning deliberately after receiving the knowledge of the truth, there no longer remains a sacrifice for sins. And so what we see in this passage, we're seeing the fear of the Lord brought out. We're seeing what's the warning if we could go back to the parable of the sower. What's the warning towards those soils where it began to spring up and then it was choked out or it was torn away? If we go on sinning deliberately after receiving the knowledge of the truth, there no longer remains a sacrifice for sins. So where else are you going to go if you've rejected Jesus? You're going to go back to the sacrificial system? It's not there. You're going to go towards something else, your own works, your own abilities, it's not there. If you're going to reject Jesus, there is no sacrifice that you're going to be able to turn to. But what is there instead? But a fearful expectation of judgment and a fury of fire that will consume the adversaries. Anyone who has set aside the law of Moses dies without mercy on the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. How much worse punishment do you think will be deserved by the one who has trampled underfoot the Son of God? And who has profaned the blood of the covenant by which he was sanctified and has outraged the Spirit of grace. For we know him who said, vengeance is mine, I will repay. And again, the Lord will judge his people. It is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. And so we see a God of justice, a God that we do see judgment coming from him over those who have rejected Jesus Christ. Because understand this, you cannot get to God on your own. The sacrifice of Jesus Christ is the only sacrifice that will get you to God. He is the way, the truth, the life, John chapter number 14. And Jesus, his own words, he said, no man comes to the Father except through me. And here's what that means. You cannot get to God on your own, and neither can I. Nothing we can do can get us there. And so we see that there is either this salvation, this redemption that is offered, or there is judgment and justice that stands on those who reject and push away and turn away from God. We find that without Jesus, we're all enemies of God, the book of Romans, Paul writes. We are against him and opposed to him. But through the blood of Jesus Christ alone are we reconciled or made whole. Verse 32, but recall the former days when after you were enlightened, you endured a hard struggle with sufferings. Sometimes being publicly exposed to reproach and affliction, sometimes being partners with those so treated. So sometimes you endured these persecutions. Sometimes your friends, you watched them endure these persecutions, fearing if it would be you. Verse 34, you had compassion on those in prison. You joyfully accepted the plundering of your property since you knew that you yourselves had a better possession and an abiding one. So one that continues and one that lives on. Therefore, do not throw away your confidence, which has a great reward. For you have need of, watch this word, endurance. You have need of endurance, so that when you have done the will of God, you may receive what is promised. For yet a little while, the coming one will come and will not delay, but my righteous one shall live by faith. And if he shrinks back, my soul has no pleasure in him. But we are not of those who shrink back and are destroyed, but of those who have faith and preserve their souls. As we look at these passages, as we look at these last couple of paragraphs in chapter number 10, here's what we see. We see that the path of life is difficult, whether you follow Jesus or not. The path of life is difficult, whether you follow Jesus or not. But the difference here is the destination. And as we push towards this finish line, as we push towards the end of our race, we need endurance to reach the finish line. So then how do we do these things? How do we follow Jesus in this invitation in our day-to-day lives? Let me encourage you with this as we conclude our time together this morning. 1997, a man named Gary McPherson. He studied 157 children. They picked out and they began to learn an instrument. Some of these children went on to become excellent musicians. Some faltered and some just flat out quit. McPherson searched for the traits that separated those who progressed from those who did not. He looked at things like IQ. Do the more intelligent children continue? He looked at things like natural musical aptitude. Those who started out quickly, did they finish strong to the end? He looked at all these different variables, whether it be income or parents, marital status, and things like that. All of these things. And at the end of the day, he found that one trait stood out above the rest when it came to longevity in playing these instruments. And it was one question that they had been asked before they even selected their instruments. Here was the question: how long do you think you will play? How long do you think you will play? The children that had in their mind decided that they would play for the rest of their lives or for decades, they continued to play. The children that said, oh, well, I have band this year, and so I'm going to play this year, surprisingly enough, they quit. So here's the question I want to pose to you today as we speak of the endurance necessary to follow after Jesus. How long do you plan to follow Jesus? How long do you plan to follow Jesus? Is this a decision that we make and, well, the season of life I'm in right now, it's difficult, and so I'm going to follow Jesus right now until my marriage gets healthier? Is that where we're at? Because if you plan to follow Jesus for that long, then, maybe your marriage gets healthier, maybe it doesn't. And then afterwards, who knows where your faith is going to go? How long do you plan to follow Jesus? Is it a phase of life thing? Is it, well, I want my kids to see me following Jesus while they're at home, but when they move out, we'll see what happens? What is it? How long do you actually intend to follow after Jesus? And the answer to this question, I believe, is going to determine a lot about where you're actually going to go in your spiritual walk. Because if you say, I'm just here because so-and-so told me to be here, hey, listen, that's their faith. Where's yours? How long do you plan to follow Jesus? Because at the end of the day, where salvation comes, it's for those who endure. For those that following Jesus, it's not just a fad. It's not just a decision that we take lightly. But following Jesus, this is the meaning of our lives. He gave himself for me, and so why would I do anything less than give myself for him? And there's a very strong warning that's attached to those who would say, oh, well, I'll do the Jesus thing for a little while. Is that the call that God's placed on our lives? If Jesus is better than anything else that this world can offer, then why would we trade this for this? What's wrong with us? Maybe you've never considered this question before. You're just like, church is one of the things that I do. Well, hey, today, where do you see yourself in 10, 20, 40, 50, 60 years? What are you doing with your life? What are your goals? What are those plans? If I had to say, hey, tell me everything you want to do with your life. Oh, I want to retire. I want to buy a house here. I want to do this. I want to do this. No. Tell me what you want to do with Jesus. Because at the end of the day, that's the thing that actually matters. And that's it. That's it. Because someday everything else is going to fade away. It's going to be destroyed. We're going to lose it. It's going to go to the wind. Everything else in your life, temporary. Temporary. But Jesus, same yesterday, today, forever. So today, where are you? Maybe you're sitting here today and you've never made a decision to follow after Jesus. You've never trusted him as your Savior. You're trying to do the works thing, or you're trying to figure everything out. Hey, listen, He's the way, he's the truth, he's the life, he's it. Maybe you say, Nate, I'm a good person, and I'm glad for that. I'm glad for that. But being a good person doesn't mean that we get to God. We get to God through Jesus Christ. And today, if you've put your faith in Jesus, what are you doing with it? How long do you plan to follow him?